I have known David since I was 10 years old. I'm 67 now, so that makes it a little under 60 years ago. I remember at that time going on CND marches and talking to Mum about the possibility of nuclear war. My father was a committed communist and believed in the Marxist analysis of world events. He did feel that the contradictions of capitalism would eventually compel the world to seek a fair and just society. I don't want to say too much more than that, for fear of putting words into his or David's mouth. Suffice it to say that David describes himself as a committed communist and a Marxist. With that, I will hand it over to you, David.
Thank you, Rob. It's a great pleasure to be chatting with you like this after all these years. You referred to our early days marching from Aldermaston, trying to get rid of the bomb. Sadly, there are more bombs around now than in more hands than there were then. So we've got a lot of ground to make up. Like you, and like millions of people, I'm very concerned about the increase in military expenditure, the military activity that is taking place all over the world today. It's the powers that be, of course, attempt to justify this increase in militarism on the grounds of defense and security. Well, every sovereign state has the right to defend itself and the duty to provide security for its people. But that hardly explains why, for instance, the military expenditure of the United States is almost equal to that of the whole of the rest of the world put together. And why there are US bases in 100 or more countries around the world. Surely that is not necessary for the defense of the United States or for the security of the American people. So we need to try to find some explanation of what is going on. What are the roots of this drive to war? And of course of the actual war which is happening at the moment in the Ukraine, which we are all devastated by and would like to see brought to an end as soon as possible. But we need to go behind the surface to see what is really happening. I've just been listening to a couple of academics who you actually introduced me to.
How do we bring them in?
One is John Mearsheimer, and the other is Jeffrey Sachs.
I'm particularly interested in Mearsheimer because I believe he thinks he has a reason for the need for empires, which is could be disputed, but I'd be interested in your views on him.
Well, as I mean, I've only listened to a couple of his talks, but as I understand it, his view is that the world is organized in great powers. The majority of the population of the world come under one great power or another, directly or indirectly. And it is the nature of great powers to compete and that this competition inevitably leads to war. That is, as I understand it, his account of what
he felt that the empires were one. I've forgotten the guy's name. The Greek who said that every time a great power rises, another great power is going to challenge that rise. What mystifies me is that this has happened over and over. The Dutch were beaten by the English. The English, strangely, negotiated with the American Empire, and it was a relatively peaceful handover. But previous to that, it usually produces war. So I'm curious to know why it has to be war, why there isn't another way.
That's an interesting question, Rob. Can I come to it?
Come to it in your own time.
In my own time, because having mentioned Mersheim, I want to mention Sachs, because he also thinks that he's got an explanation of what is happening. But as far as I can make out, although he has some very acute insights into the way things happen. For instance, his remark that the United States presidents really know very little about foreign policy, and in fact they have very little influence on foreign policy. There is a foreign policy establishment which bridges both the two main parties in the United States, and that is what controls
Mearsheimer calls them the blob. Mearsheimer referred to them as the blob. You can't
the
get
blob,
the blob.
Yes.
But who exactly the blob are is
right.
another matter.
But Sachs gives the impression that it is a result of reckless and stupid people controlling affairs that leads us into the state we're in. Well, now, it seems to me that both these accounts, although they're perfectly accurate and tell us a lot about what's going on, are much more descriptive than analytical. We need to know why the great powers behave as they do. We need to know why the reckless and stupid people are able to get away with it. So I think, as a Marxist, I think that one has to look behind the appearances and try to tease out the underlying reality. Now, for me, the underlying reality is the capitalist system, which has dominated the world for, say, 3 centuries, and which means that the motive for economic activity, which is the basic activity of humankind, the motive is profit, private profit. There may well be other subsidiary motives, but the system is so arranged that unless the owners of capital, the owners of the means of production, set out to make the maximum possible profit, they're going to fail and the system breaks down. So we need to look at how capitalism has affected the relations between state and the prospects of peace and war. We go back to the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution, which started in our country, in Britain, enabled Britain to be the dominant power in the world throughout the 19th century. Of course, it wasn't just the Industrial Revolution. Britain also had the most powerful navy in the world, which it didn't hesitate to use. throughout the 19th century. There were naval skirmishes and even more than skirmishes, like when they wiped out the Chinese Navy in the Opium Wars. But my point is that the world was dominated by British imperialism, and that is why there were no major wars during the 19th century. Though there were an awful lot of small ones.
They kept
and a lot of people suffered. Then came, of course, inevitably, because capitalism, one of the features of capitalism is that development is uneven between different countries. And inevitably, other countries rose to challenge British economic supremacy, in particular, Germany and the United States. Britain had its empire, which was absolutely essential to the success of British capitalism. The United States didn't really need an empire because it was so big anyway, and it had its own territory to conquer.
It had the whole of the Western Hemisphere.
But Germany was in an entirely different situation. Germany had no empire, and needed one, and that really was the cause of the First World War, the imperialist war. Germany needed colonies, and the only place Germany had lost out in the scramble for Africa. It had come a bit late into it. It needed colonies, and the only way to get them was to fight against Britain and France, who had the colonies. So I think that, that's the simple source of the First World War. Now
I can edit this, by the way.
If we jump to the Second World War, which also had its origins in the German need to expand. German capitalists need to expand. Of course, the Second World War, it became a genuine world war and total war. But there was one great victor in that war, and that was the United States. In the United States, capitalism developed tremendously its productive forces during the Second World War. There were some dramatic things like the number of cargo ships that were built in very short time to supply the people of Europe and the troops fighting in Europe. So the war ended with most of the world pretty shattered one way or another, with the one great exception of the United States, which came out of the war immensely stronger. In fact, it came out of the war as the strongest, both economically and militarily, power that there had ever been in world history. And American capitalism saw the opportunity to exploit and dominate the whole world. And that became their strategy.
The Marshall Plan, plainly, was the Americans selling their products to the world, lending the world the money, and winning twice over.
Absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head. And of course, along with the Marshall Plan went NATO, which was a means of tying Britain and Western Europe at that stage to American imperialism, so that we became second-class citizens, if you like, in the world pecking order. Hence the special relationship, so-called, between Britain and the United States, which means that Britain helps to sustain American rule over much of the world. So but of course, in order to maintain its supremacy, it has had to fight wars. And in fact, it's been fighting wars for most of the period.
Been a year go
since
by.
1945, you know.
The war.
The wars in Korea, in Vietnam, the invasion of Grenada, the invasion of Panama, and so on. Afghanistan, Iraq. I mean, these are, in essence, all part of the drive by American imperialism to control the world, to control the world's markets, to control the world's resources.
These days, it's a dollar world. The dollar is the last resort of money.
That's right.
The empire of money.
Oh yes, and getting everybody to use the dollar, of course, has been one of the means by which the United States capitalism has preserved its control. Now, its only rival, it was the Soviet Union, which is why it fought a Cold War very seriously and succeeded in the end in bringing down the Soviet Union. What has taken its place, of course, is another rival, but not nearly such a potentially strong rival as the Soviet Union, and also, of course, not, and this is the important thing, not an ideological rival. I mean, the part of the reason for the Cold War was not just that the Soviet Union was potentially an economic rival. The other reason was that the Soviet Union offered a different way of organizing things, which might well appeal to a lot of people in the world, which was the last thing that the United States rulers wanted. So that was an additional reason for the Cold War. Okay, so the end of the Cold War, the end of history. So Fukuyama said, which is it's a very interesting formulation, really, because in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels said that all history is the history of class struggles. Well, Fukuyama was saying the class struggle has ended, so it's the end of history, which is really confirmation of what Marx and Engels were saying. Of course, he was wrong, and he soon realized he was wrong, as everybody else did. It didn't last for very long because of a number of factors, but mainly, I think, because of the rise of China. This was something which nobody had foreseen. China under Mao Zedong had got into a bit of a mess, and nobody expected really that it would become a dominant power in the world so very soon. So the danger, the greatest danger of war now lies in East Asia.
In the Chinese, not in the Russians.
No, the Russians are not a great danger. Russia isn't strong enough. We could talk more about the war in Ukraine, of course. I just finished. Well, I've really come to the end of my point. I mean, I think that the situation we have today is that this American domination, which became unipolar, as they've put it, after the fall of the Soviet Union, is coming to an end.
Mm.
It's coming to an end. The Chinese economy has been rapidly catching up with the American in sheer size. Of course, in GDP per head, it's still way below the American level.
Mm.
But in sheer size, it's catching up. Now, there's a lot of discussion now about whether China is reaching its peak and so on. But there's no doubt on my mind that it will continue to develop. But we could talk about that if you want to. But I hope I've made my point that the source of war, the origins of war, are in the attempts by one capitalist ruling class or another to dominate the world, and to dominate the world in order to maximize their profits. I mean, that sounds simplistic, and of course there are all sorts of complications, but I believe that essentially that is what has happened and is happening.